There we go. Okay, so let me try to sum up what was just said. I'm not going to try to repeat this event because somebody asked an interesting question and I gave what I thought was an interesting answer. Some other people thought it was an interesting answer. I don't want to try to recreate that, but I'll try to sum it up. Some folks are having difficulty getting their skeletal sketch and their prose paragraph to match one another. They're finding that when they write their skeletal sketch, they have one idea of the argument. When they write their prose paragraph, it seems like the structure is a little bit different. Now, to a certain extent, that's to be expected because natural language doesn't necessarily always follow this plan that you make ahead of time before you start talking. Extemporaneous conversations that we have with our friends, most of the conversations that we have with our friends, even in a lot of our writing, when you send a text message to somebody, when you send an email to somebody, when you post something on Facebook or some other form of social media, how often do you write it down first, walk away, think about it, come back, maybe revise it a little bit, and then post, or then send the message? Most of the times it's just the first draft of our thoughts. So, one of the things that we might be thinking about is can I get that style of speech? That's one of the things that the prose paragraph is asking you to do. It's trying to get you to use the same style of speech that you use in normal conversation, not bullet-pointed sort of skeletal sketches of arguments, but something resembling normal conversational tone. And can you get it to follow the structure that you have in your skeletal sketch? Can you take advantage of the fact that writing doesn't have to be extemporaneous, that you can plan ahead of time and then say something and have it be a little clearer, make a little more sense, be a little more structured, be a little easier for your reader to follow, and to kind of be a little bit more transparent and critical? This is called critical thinking. What's the critical part? It's part of it is self-critical thinking, right? Saying that just because I believe something doesn't necessarily mean that I should believe it. And so I'm going to take a critical attitude towards my beliefs and put them to the test of what are the actual reasons? What are the arguments for why I should believe these things? All right. Was that kind of, sort of? Is that more or less what I said? All right. Another workshop for argument analysis assignments. That's what's up today. And last time we got to explore, I thought it was a great example that we ended up using because we got to explore one of the sides of the dilemma where the argument kind of fell into place really quickly and we got a sense of oh yeah, that is a pretty simple argument. There's more to be said about it. We'll have to kind of elaborate on some of these things in the prose paragraph. But the basic structure of the argument was pretty clear. I think it was a modus tollens argument. And then we had another argument where we had some strong intuitions that this idea that we had, some kind of sentiment, was relevant to the conclusion that we were trying to come to. But we were having trouble spelling it out in forms of an argument. And as we continued to poke and prod at that, it was somewhere over here when we did it. As we continued to poke and prod at that, we got a whole variety of possible arguments that seemed like they were a little bit clearer than the vague intuition that we were groping at first, right? And we didn't necessarily pin those down yet, but that's a big part of this process, right? Is kind of starting with what's my first response to this, and then say yeah, but that's not really a good reason yet. That's not really a good argument yet. What would a better argument look like? And it might take a different route. One thing that we didn't talk about at all at the last session, and that I want to devote more time to at this session, is once I get those arguments, how do I determine which one is better and which one is worse? That last part, the most crucial part, the part where you make up your mind. Bless you. So let's start with an example that hopefully somebody can provide, where we think I've got the skeletal sketches of my two arguments that I'm looking at, my argument 1 and my argument 2. I've got those skeletal sketches down pretty well. I'm pretty confident in them. I don't think we're going to have to tinker with them too much. Let's start with that, and we can devote most of our attention to, okay, so which of them is better, instead of trying to figure out, what exactly is our argument. Maggie, you got something?
I'm doing mine on the Obamacare.
What about Obamacare? Let's turn it into a question at first.
Do you think cutting Obamacare is right for the country?
Is a good idea? Now, do we mean specifically in the tax bill that, we read news stories about? Or, repealing it at all?
Yes.
Which? Those are two things.
The Senate plans to end Obamacare mandate and revise tax proposal.
To do it in the tax bill. That sets the bar a little lower, right? Can we all kind of recognize that if you're or it sets the bar lower for one side at least, right? If what you're going to say is something like, I don't think that the Affordable Care Act should be repealed, or essential provisions in the Affordable Care Act should be repealed, these provisions that I'll list for you. If I don't think that they should be repealed, it's harder for me to make it as a more general case than it would be to say, like, maybe it should be repealed, maybe it shouldn't, but it shouldn't be repealed in this way, right? You could be, you're attacking a more specific point by saying, let's not include it in the tax bill. So let's start with that. We'll know that, like, we're already kind of stacking the deck, so, like, we're going to have to take care to make sure that we're charitable to both sides now. Should ACA repeal be part of the tax bill? That's moved out of committee now, and, like, will be voted on sometime over the break. The Senate version, at least. So should this be part of the tax bill? And what are our two possible answers? Yes and no, right?
No.
And what are your two arguments, Maggie? Let's start with the yes argument.
I've got the two sides I've got are Republicans and Democrats.
So we're presuming that Republicans are going to be on the yes side and
Yes.
Democrats are going to be on the no side? We've just renamed the yes and no side, though, right? These aren't, like, reasons not yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The Democrats believe that cutting Obamacare would underwrite tax cuts for the rich. Under the no section.
So on the no side, we want to say something like, don't sacrifice health care for
all.
well, it wouldn't be for all. Like only some people would be like, well, some, most. We'd have to know the numbers. How many people would be affected, right? But maybe we want to say don't sacrifice health care for anybody, for the sake of tax cuts for the wealthy. Maybe we want to start with that as, like, a moral principle, and we want to say that, like, here's a premise that I would expect people to agree with. Do we think that you can expect the other side to agree with this principle?
No.
You don't. Then maybe this isn't a good premise to start with. Maybe we need to go more primitive. Maybe we need to justify this. So how would we make, like, if somebody's like, I'm not sure if I think that we shouldn't sacrifice health care in exchange for tax cuts to the wealthy.
I mean, you should agree with it.
What if I don't? How will you convince me?
Because if you and me get hurt,
Mm-hmm.
and you're richer than I am,
Okay.
we should get the same treatment. If we have the same illness.
There should be equality of healthcare? Absolute equality of healthcare?
Not absolute equality, but
Basic equality, or equality of basic healthcare?
yeah.
There should be like a kind of like a minimum level that we say that, like, nobody should have less healthcare than this. If you're rich and you want to have, like, awesome stuff,
Yeah.
then you can go buy the awesome stuff. But, like, here's the lower limit. This is already messy. I can think of, like, ways that, like, this is splintering into something. We can talk later about ways to simplify this. So in the meantime, do you mind if I
Yeah, change it. Okay.
not only change it, but, like, can we just jump to a new example? Because unless somebody wants to, do we want to build off of this and say, like, I think I've got two pretty clear arguments? Because, like I said, I didn't want to spend a whole lot of our time figuring out what arguments we're dealing with. I want to spend a little more time figuring out which of the two arguments is working for us.
I just want to know, before we move forward, the exact meaning of that question.
There are provisions in the Senate version of this new tax bill that remove key provisions of the Affordable Care Act. And it seems to be the case that some people are saying, and perhaps we call them Democrats, and maybe it's just a category that happens to line up with it, but some people are saying, like, you shouldn't do that. And it's a reason perhaps to not vote on that bill, or to not vote for the bill. And some folks are saying, no, we should do that, and we should vote on the bill, and we should vote yes. Right? I can think of, like, a pretty simple, straightforward version of the no argument. Maybe we can help us out to, like, figure out a version of the yes argument. We could say something like,
Sacrifice health care for all,
I can do even simpler than like figuring out like whether or not healthcare is a right, or trying to figure out like how to measure the benefits of a tax cut to the wealthy versus the benefits of like healthcare being provided to somebody. But we might say something like the Republicans tried to repeal the ACA recently, just a few months ago, and that attempt did not work. So we might say something like, this makes the tax bill unnecessarily complicated and like controversial. It doesn't need to be part of the tax bill. Therefore, get it out. Or if you don't get it out, we should vote no on it. Like this is like bad statecraft. So maybe we got a couple of other arguments or a couple of other premises that need to be bridging here, something like that. So maybe this bill makes the current version of the tax bill makes things unnecessarily complicated and unnecessarily controversial. Legislation should not be like this. Or we could say something like, this is bad legislation. This is bad legislation. Maybe that's the premise that I want to use. This makes the tax bill unnecessarily complicated and controversial. This is bad legislation when it does that, when it makes something unnecessarily complicated and controversial. You shouldn't vote to enact bad legislation. Therefore, like, we should vote no on this bill, or it shouldn't include ACA repeal. That's a pretty simple argument. Is there a yes version? That's also simple. What does it look like?
The Republicans have tried 48 times in the last 6 years to repeal the ACA, and if they can't do it with this legislation, they can't do it.
This is going to be different than the last 48 times? Like, this is going to be the time they're like, I guess we just can't do it. We can't try again? How is that part of the yes argument? It should be, we should include it to like make the point that like, see, you still can't do it. I don't know if that's the best argument for including it. It certainly seems to not be the argument that people that would tend to answer yes would tend to give. I think they would probably assume something is necessary for this. One thing that I could imagine is something like this. ACA repeal is, and I'm not even sure how true this is, but I believe that there's something like we should definitely there's empirical fact checking to be done on this claim. ACA repeal is part of funding the tax cuts, so it's relevant.
Exactly.
You can't just say it's not germane to tax reform, and so like get rid of it. It's how we're going to fund this particular tax reform. So it is relevant. We should include it in this bill. It doesn't matter that it was unnecessarily controversial, or that it was controversial in the past. It doesn't matter that we had trouble passing the bill earlier. We need to keep trying. Perhaps we might even make a further argument. We should keep trying, or a different argument. We should keep trying because this is what we promised when we ran. And the people who voted for us, our constituents who elected us, apparently wanted what we promised. We said again and again and again that we're going to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So we need to, in order to effectively represent my constituents, I need to do what I promised I would do. That's another version of an argument here, right? Both fairly simple, I think. Relatively simple. Yes?
Years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the individual mandate was considered a tax. So that's what to make it constitutional.
Yeah. And it is a tax. The mandatory coverage penalty, right? Yeah. What do they call it? The individual mandate. Is a tax. According to who? Says who it's a tax? Says the Supreme Court, a decent authority on these matters. In fact, that was part of the argument that was made for defendants of the Affordable Care Act for why it was constitutional, because otherwise it would have been a fine. And then that would have been maybe an overreach of government's coercive power. That was the argument, back in the Supreme Court case about this, right? So, do we have a clear enough sense of what the arguments on either side are? can we move into this question of which is stronger? And here's maybe the tougher challenge. Can we do it without like relying primarily on our intuitions about what the answer to this question was in the first place? Can you try to suspend whatever opinions that you have about like how you would answer the yes or no question? Look at the arguments such as they've been made and tell me which is the better argument, and let that decision about which is the better argument determine what you should believe. That last part's trickier too, but like, can we at least figure out which one we think is the better argument without some sort of belief bias? It is part, and it is a tax, and at least that undermines this argument, right? Okay. What do we think? How would you determine which argument is stronger? Yep.
I think, like, since the question is, should it be part of the tax bill at all, it really talk about, like, is it best for the country or is it best for the taxpayers? And says, like, should be part of the bill. And I think the yes side provides a better explanation for that, because we say, like, how you said before, like, it is, like, relevant to the bill. Like,
yeah.
if it's going to be part of anything, it should be part of it.
Yeah, so the arguments such as we've constructed them so far are like, it should not be part of the repeal, or the repeal should not be part of the tax bill because it's not relevant. And these guys say, but it is relevant. And we're like, okay, well, is it relevant or is it not relevant? The claim being made over here that the Supreme Court says it's a tax, and presumably taxes are relevant to a tax bill, seems to decide the day. At least, yeah. So I agree with you guys. The arguments such as we've made them so far say, like, that the answer should be yes. Were those the best arguments, though? Some of you, I could tell, maybe like you started out wanting to answer no to this, and now you're thinking to yourself like, shit, I'm not going to change my mind just yet. Good. Principle of conservatism suggests that your beliefs should be a little bit sticky. But don't do it dogmatically. Don't just cling to the belief. Do we need to rework the arguments? Should it be on different footing? It was suggested that we tried to have this fight over whether or not healthcare bill repeals were relevant to a tax reform bill. But maybe that's not where we want to have the fight. Maybe we want to have the fight in terms of like what's more beneficial to more people. These arguments are going to look very different if we do it that way, right? So this is this process. This is kind of this dialectical process of like make the arguments, see how they pan out. If you're thinking to yourself like, that still doesn't seem right. Well, like, maybe that's your bias talking. Maybe we didn't look at the best arguments. Back to the drawing board, perhaps? See if we can find better arguments, see how those pan out. If you find yourself doing this over and over and over again and coming to like the opposite answer for like the one that you expect every time, maybe it's time to change your mind. And be careful that you don't fall prey to that belief bias where you start thinking to yourself like, the arguments that I'm just waiting for the one argument that confirms my belief. And that's the one that I'm going to say is like the best argument. Well, like, try to be as honest about this as possible. Jimmy, you had your hand up?
Yeah, if it's simple as if it's mathematical reasons why they want to vote yes.
Mathematical reasons?
Well, I mean the money, because in the bill just costing too much money.
Oh, so yeah, maybe like forget about all of this stuff. Maybe we could say something about the tax bill is just it's too expensive. It's too expensive. It's gonna negatively affect the deficit. It's gonna positively affect it. It's gonna make the deficit go up, right? It's gonna increase the deficit. But that's not about whether or not ACA repeal should be part of the tax bill. That's about whether or not the tax bill is good or not. That's a completely different question, which you were at liberty to pursue for this assignment, right? That News You Can Use thing said like read some articles and then articulate a question. We articulated the question in this way. Maybe we want to articulate the question in a different way. This is an awful lot, I think, of like what conversation through political agreement is about. It's like figuring out like what are we going to talk about? Like what exactly is the question? So figuring that out is relatively important. Yeah.
I have a defense for the nose.
A defense for the nose?
I feel like if
On this question, or are we changing the question to like...
on this exact question.
Yeah, okay.
Should the ACA be repealed? I feel like if the ACA was truly in the jurisdiction of Senate appropriations, then they would have tried to attach it to a tax bill before instead of lump summing the entirety of the ACA to repeal it.
So what is that? Is that to suggest that like
That,
there were...
picking apart different aspects of the bill is greater.
Then the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That like you shouldn't try to take apart a policy piece by piece because why? Maybe there are just pieces that I think are bad and other pieces that I think are good, so I want to keep the parts that I like and get rid of the parts that I don't like. But then again, we might say something like, well, you might break the whole thing. The whole thing might collapse if you take a key part out. And then somebody might say, like, well, what's so bad about that? Maybe I want the whole thing to collapse. Maybe that's the point. Now maybe we have a different question, like, should you want the whole thing to collapse? Shall we try a different example? Let's try this again, see how it plays with a different question. Maybe one that's not from the news one as well. Because those in particular tend to be, they're squirrely questions, right? You can go in lots of different ways, and you might find yourself that, like, as you begin to analyze the arguments that you're making, you decide, like, that wasn't the question that I really wanted to ask. I wanted to ask a different question. An important skill, but a difficult one to master. So let's start with a different one. Anybody got anything?
It can be like one of our drafts.
Sure, it could be, one that you're not using. Presumably, like, let's give somebody the opportunity here to use one that you're actually writing your final draft on.
I didn't mind the moral permissibility.
The cheeseburger argument. Okay. Cheeseburgers? Yes. No. Yes?
For yes, I said, like, since other animals, like cheetahs, lions, bears eat animals, survive, these are animals, so therefore I can use cheeseburgers.
Am I wrong? Is this it? Other animals get to eat animals. We're animals, just like the other animals, so we should get to eat animals as well. It's an argument by analogy, no?
It is.
Yeah, it's an argument by analogy. Like, the cheetah gets, like, nobody's like, evil cheetah. Are people like evil cheetah? Are all carnivores like bad guys? In the nature videos, they make it like that. Something like the music gets all dark. But, like, it's just the cheetah being the cheetah. You want it to just starve to death? Yeah, okay. Other animals get to... All right, well, yeah, maybe we'll decide that there are weaknesses with the argument. But that's a pretty clear argument, right? What about the no argument?
The no argument that it's morally prohibited to cause unnecessary pain to other beings, and eat a cheeseburger causes unnecessary pain to cows.
Don't unnecessarily harm.
Yeah, it does it.
That's a moral principle that we're willing to start with, like a no harm principle. No unnecessary harm, at least, right? That this is a principle that we're expecting that, like, everybody that we're going to talk to can get on board with us and say, like, or in the prose paragraph at least, we're going to back this up a little bit. But this is where we're starting our argument from, a principle that says, don't unnecessarily harm cheeseburgers. Unnecessarily harm. Yeah, but the main thrust of the argument is, that's a principle. Cheeseburgers do unnecessarily harm, so don't cheeseburger. Nice. Two pretty clear arguments. An argument by analogy here. This is some sort of, like, syllogistic argument. We might think about it like all instances of unnecessary harm are immoral. Eating cheeseburgers is a case of unnecessary harm, therefore eating cheeseburgers is immoral. Maybe it's a modus ponens argument at the end of the day, right? Which one's stronger? Now, this is a valid argument, right? And we decided it's like, I think that might be modus ponens underneath all the makeup. And all the, fancy clothes. That's a modus ponens. So if it's valid, and it is, if it's modus ponens, that means that so long as all its premises are true, the conclusion's got to be true. So that's a decent argument. Its weakest spot is going to be the truth of its premises, right? My argument by analogy, what's its weakest spot?
But there are a lot of differences between them.
Yeah, possible disanalogies between humans and other carnivorous or even omnivorous animals. Yeah. Are there important ones?
Yeah.
Like what?
Like the way they get their meat is a lot different than how we get their meat. Like typically people, like, a lot of people say, oh, I hunt and stuff, but like, you typically get your meat from the factory farm.
Okay.
Store.
So we've got a...
Go on.
So we've got an issue with, like, we might say something like, they do it in a natural way. Maybe we think natural equals good, and, like, unnatural equals bad. Maybe we can get a little more specific about that, and we can say, like, they do it in a sustainable way. Maybe that's true. Or they do it in a less harmful way than the way that we do it. So you could eat animals if you ate them the way that the cheetah did, which is you go chase it down yourself. Well, maybe, do you have to eat it raw? Is that the part that we care about? Or is it that you don't have a big, huge, concentrated animal feeding operation? Like you don't have like industrial meat. Yeah. Oh. When you need to. On the other side of the argument is going to be like, do you ever need to? Yeah. That's true. But perhaps ants do it. Oh, yeah. Oh. Yeah, maybe. Ants farm, so, like, we should farm. And, like, we're not saying don't farm. We're maybe saying farm in a more responsible way. We do it in a way that's not as sustainable or not as responsible as the way that the cheetah does it. Any other potential differences? Yep.
The cheetahs have to necessarily eat the cheeseburger.
Cheetahs are obligate carnivores.
The harm that they cause is necessary.
They would die otherwise. And, like, we would not die. We're omnivores. So what about bears? Are bears bad for, like, because bears are omnivores.
I mean, do we have the resources right now to switch everyone to a vegetarian diet? I mean, we kind of have to necessarily eat cheeseburgers because we don't have the resources to switch right now.
I mean, I feel like
That's a bold empirical claim. Can you back it up?
No.
Okay. Then maybe we shouldn't believe it. Maybe we shouldn't build an argument on it. Or maybe we should go try to figure out, like, is there available data to settle this question? Yeah. Could we switch? And maybe we're not even wondering, like, should we switch, like, we're not wondering, like, well, maybe we are. Are we wondering en masse, should we outlaw cheeseburgers? Is that what we're saying? Completely switch? Or are we saying, like, next time I see a cheeseburger and I'm about to eat it, I should be like, don't eat the cheeseburger.
But you already buy it.
Maybe the question's really about, should I buy it in the first place? Yeah. Yeah. This is like part of this dialectical process, right? That we get from like the yes or no is figure out, if you're doing it in a dishonest way, you could be saying like, how can I rig the question such that I'm more likely to be right? Not have to change my mind. But if you're like intellectually curious, you're going to try to figure out like, where's the question the most interesting? Where am I genuinely up in the air? Where am I like, what kind of question can I pose that's going to have me like genuinely not sure if it's yes or no on it, or if it's this response or the contrary response. And now looking at the arguments is going to be like, that's going to be an exciting event of discovery for me then, right?
So what he was saying, the question of being permissible is permissible for the cheetah, but not for us.
Or at least this analogy is weak, right? We've like made our arguments, now we're evaluating them. We might be saying this analogy is weak because there are really important differences between the way that humans eat meat and the way that the animals that we're trying to analogize, like we humans to, they do it in a different way. Also, possibly, just like for consideration, think about this maybe as like a reason for why this analogy is shaky. Humans are capable of like moral reasoning. Cheetahs are not.
Yeah.
Like humans can like deliberate about like what should I do and not just like act according to instinct. Maybe we believe that. Maybe we believe that humans are capable of that. Maybe we believe that other animals are not capable of that. But it seems like a big difference. Like the cognitive capacity to like reason about like what you ought to do seems very, very different for humans than it is for cheetahs. So maybe we shouldn't hold ourselves to the same moral standards as like those things that can't really think. What about the no argument? We said it's valid, so we're not going to attack its structure. We got to address the truth of its premises. Don't unnecessarily harm. Cheeseburgers unnecessarily harm. Is that the weaker one?
Mm-hmm.
Cheeseburgers unnecessarily harm? Or is don't unnecessarily harm the weaker one? Cheeseburgers unnecessarily harm? We think that's its weakest spot? Why should I, convince me that I shouldn't believe that cheeseburgers unnecessarily harm. What's that? You think specifically B12? B12 deficiency. There are vegetarian sources of B12, but they're a little bit expensive and hard to get your hands on. Yeah. And it would be wrong. You oughtn't do it, right? You oughtn't kick me in the shin, right? There's a good demonstration that you shouldn't unnecessarily, or it's at least, it's an example, right? It's a case where, the rule works. So are we suggesting that, were we looking to demonstrate that this is a good principle? Because it covers, the shin kicking question? Should you or should you not kick your professor in the shins? No. Why? Because it's unnecessary harm. And you shouldn't cause unnecessary harm. You might think to yourself, this was a case of necessary harm. I had to kick him in the shins.
I had to.
Otherwise, well, this brings up this question, what does that mean? Necessary for what? What would it mean to, be in a case where it was necessary for you to cause harm? There are no other alternatives? Is that a case? It's metaphysically impossible because, it's not even an option that's available other than doing harm. Is it metaphysically impossible to not eat cheeseburgers? There's just no other option?
No.
Okay. So in that case,
Be careful with
seems.
harm and pain.
Yeah.
That's the same.
Yeah. Why should we be?
Because you might be just putting a cow to sleep. I don't know how you go process it.
And it seems painless.
It's painless.
You could painlessly.
You're harming them.
You could painlessly kill a cow, but I don't know if that means that you're not harming the cow. Is there anybody here who thinks that if you do painlessly kill a cow, that's not harming the cow?
I mean, humane slaughter is still slaughter.
Still slaughter?
Killing something that.
But is it harm?
I feel like
Pain to it.
I don't know.
Okay, that's a good thing to admit. Let's see if we can mark the confusion and try to move forward through it. So
I don't think so.
is all harm pain? Is painless slaughter harmless? One way you might think about it is think about yourself, right? If somebody painlessly killed you, would they have harmed you? I don't know if the cow is capable of that sort of belief.
Well, any place is better than the farm, right?
But I don't know if cows have the capacity to imagine better places.
What if the cow doesn't know what's going on?
Maybe they do, and we want to and we have good reasons to suggest that they can do this, and we can also maybe demonstrate that there's a way of ranching them such that we can teach them to believe in a better place. Might even be able to get them to believe that it's going to be good when they get slaughtered. And they'll look forward. What's
It's
that?
gonna be helping people.
Sausage party movie, the groceries, they feel like that there's a better place out there.
And the better place is getting eaten.
That's true.
It's fulfilling their destiny.
It's their destiny to be eaten.
Might even think, I've heard some people make the argument that because these animals are bred for human consumption, their destiny is to be eaten. So we are helping them fulfill their destiny. Honestly, that strikes me as incredibly anthropocentric and self-centric, right? To believe that the purpose of something else is to serve me, but
it's fine.
What would you do with all the pigs if you didn't kill them? Because there are more pigs than there are humans in certain states. So what would you do with all of them if you didn't kill them? Did you eat them? That's why they.
First, we stopped breeding them. That's why there's so many.
And then they inject them with stuff that has. So they have.
let them live out their lives until they die, and don't artificially inseminate them to make new ones that are gonna suffer.
You keep feeding them and feeding them.
You know what? I agree with Jimmy. I totally agree with you, and I think we should extend this logic to what we do about refugee crises. When there's got all these people, we don't know where to put them. Let's kill them and eat them.
Wait a minute.
Because what are you gonna do? Let them just what are you gonna do with all these people, right? No, that's a bad analogy. Or is it a good analogy, an analogy that like shows us that this should be abhorrent? Maybe it's a bad analogy because I was comparing doing it to people to doing it to like non-human animals. Pigs.
Can you barbecue a person?
Yes.
With a big enough barbecue, sure, why not? Yeah. And patience, right? Slow and low. I hear it tastes more or less like pig. From people who have eaten human. Not firsthand, like reports that they've written down. Yeah. There are like many cannibalistic tribes, like I think still in existence, and definitely in the last 100 years when people started like being interested in like, let's interview the people in the cannibalistic tribe. And let's maybe even participate in some of their rituals, including eating humans. For science. This would bring up a whole different, a similar, but a very different question, right? Which is like, if you're a scientist, if you're an anthropologist studying cannibalistic tribes, and they offer you some human meat, should you eat it? Yeah, there might be health reasons not to. They cook it.
Wasn't there like a whole study on like an island of people who ate other people, and then like they started getting like this brain disease, and they're like, why are they getting this brain disease?
Prion disease, yeah, it's mad cow disease. It's the same problem that we have. Yeah, if we're just kind of like, that's why like eating humans would be different. Like we have that problem with cows too.
So wait, is it morally permissible for cows to eat each other? Like if cows created cheeseburgers for themselves?
Like is the intuition is kind of like their species, their business. We shouldn't get involved.
Well, because you can make an analogy.
Is
That people and
cannibalism
cows,
right?
It would be wrong for cows to eat cows, like we can people. But
Yeah.
I think cannibalism like within any species is like frowned upon. I don't think the cows know.
It happens in some, like in plenty of species.
I mean,
Not a fertile one.
I mean, like all mammals, like mothers do that. Like their baby is like, they're not all of them, but like most of them, like if their baby.
They reclaim the nutrients.
Yeah, because they lost a lot of protein. So then.
That might be when we start thinking about necessary harm or something like that. Like, if not, I'll die. And, like, things are so bad, it's not just like, I'm going to kill the baby so that I can live. And maybe you're entitled to do that. Maybe if a baby's, like, threatening to kill you, and it's you or the baby, like, you're allowed to kill the baby first. Where was I going with that? But yeah, we could say something like, if it's going to be me and the baby dying, or like just the baby dies, probably better that just the baby dies. So let's eat the
I
baby.
think it'd be better if you died.
Hamsters, I know, like I had a hamster when I was a kid, and it did that, and it freaked me out. I was like, what? I was way too young to learn about that. All right. So what did we come to any sort of decision? This is a potentially weak analogy, we decided, right? That inductive arguments are already going to be a little weaker than deductive arguments because of like the validity issue. But this, as an analogy, is also not a very strong analogy on account of some very important differences between humans and the non-human wild animals that eat other animals. Maybe we want to adjust that analogy and make it a little bit different. But for the sake of conversation, let's leave it as it is and say it's a bit of a weak analogy. This is a valid argument, but have we decided that like that's the premise too, is the suspect premise? So we're stacking up like how suspect this premise is against how weak this analogy is. Does that help at all? Does that focus our decision? Maybe it's a little bit, some folks are thinking like it's a little bit apples and oranges-y.
I think
Like at the end of the day, is this a believable premise or not? It is a believable premise. There are reasons that we can come up with to doubt it, but they're not compelling enough to move you. What do you think? You floated the B12 deficiency possibility. Is that kind of like one could say, or are you thinking to yourself like, no, I would say, and I disagree with this premise?
Like I tried like how to like argue against or for G-Bird.
Yeah.
I could not.
You had trouble doing it? This is like you came up with something like this and you were kind of like, yeah, but like that's not totally convincing, perhaps.
Yeah, just because like like I don't know, like at the end of the argument, like I just came to the conclusion that like since humans are moral beings, we have a moral, and since we do have the option to give vitamins and stuff to keep us from these vitamin deficiencies, at the end of the day we have a moral obligation
Yeah.
to not kill anything.
What about the painless slaughter option? Did anybody find that compelling? That like maybe it's not the unnecessary part that we should be focused on with cheeseburgers. It's the harm part. Like, yeah, it's not that it's necessary to do this. You're right. Like, we could get by without like killing the cows to like munch on them and enjoy them. But I don't necessarily think it's harm, because I think maybe I think cows are just not capable of being harmed. Let's start there. Is it possible to harm a cow?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Cows aren't capable of higher processing nutrients. If you kill a cow, the cow itself isn't losing out on a great life.
Can it experience pain?
Yes.
But that
Yeah,
doesn't
but-
matter.
Pain
Or
doesn't
the
matter.
conscious.
This is a line of argument that some people will make. They'll say sentience isn't enough for like moral patienthood, right? Sentience isn't enough. It's not just that you can experience pain. You have to be able to, or maybe it's a splitting hairs on the question of sentience. You have to be able to suffer. And suffering is more than just experiencing pain. It's like experiencing pain and having some concept of like, I am experiencing pain. This is not as good a life as I should be living. I am disappointed.
I mean, the cows can definitely.
I don't think
Studies like cows, they have best friends, and they have other cows they enjoy being around. They can like.
Does that prove that they're capable of suffering?
Yeah, they can suffer because like they realize what life is when they're not suffering versus when they are. Like when they're. What is pain?
Yes.
People use conditioning and use pain on animals to teach them behavior, so they do have a consciousness of life.
They choose. Yeah, they make, I don't know if we would call them choices or decisions or something like that, but they have clear preferences, right? If you give a non-human animal an option between like painful consequence, pleasant consequence, it will go to its actions will tell you which it prefers. And is that not enough to say that like the cow's got a sense of like better and worse? No?
I mean, what's the consciousness here? The cow doesn't. I mean, that's.
Yeah,
unusual.
that's a really good point. We could probably make the same argument about very small children, that they're not capable, they have no higher order like thought processes either. So you can't really harm them. So go ahead and just like have at. And we could probably say the same thing about the mentally disabled. That they can't be harmed. You're over here?
If you went over here, if you did say, well, I'm not the one who's harming them, it's permissible for me to eat them, then are you hurting the people that, is that discounting the people that do kill them?
I feel like we dealt with that the first round on this when we did like the initial argument by analogy, where I said something like, I get my friend to do the kitten head stomping for me and I listen, and we decided like, that doesn't excuse you. If you hire somebody to murder somebody else, like, you're guilty of murder. Or conspiracy to murder at least, right? Getting a middleman to do your dirty work doesn't excuse you of guilt. Yes, Selena. Yeah, jump.
So,
Yeah. It's too late. You jumped. Let's do it.
So the part about having to identify and explain the argument, how long should that be? I just don't want to under-explain and be like a wimpy little...
Right. So, yeah, you can probably get away with just a couple of sentences there. So, for example, over here, what did we decide? This was an argument. What kind of argument? Argument by analogy. What makes an argument by analogy good?
The relevant similarities.
Yeah, the relevant similarities between the two analogs. What's its weakness? What makes it bad? Yeah, relevant dissimilarities. Relevant dissimilarities are going to make it weaker. So, like, now I've kind of, like, mapped out, like, what style of argument this is and what sorts of standards I need to hold it to in order to determine if it's good or bad. Over here, we'll say, what kind of argument was this? This was, we decided, modus ponens at the end of the day. It's valid, so as long as its premises are true, the conclusion is going to have to be true. So its weakest spot is going to be its premises. In particular, it looked like premise 2 was its weakest spot. I'm actually not sure that like we picked the right premise to interrogate there. I think this one maybe is more suspect than this one. Because I think maybe we excuse all kinds of behavior that causes unnecessary harm.
Yeah, we all turn a blind
I
eye
think anything but like the best option available is going to cause some unnecessary harm. And we seem to let ourselves off the hook for not choosing the best option every time. So where do we draw the line? ends up being an argument about like what are known as supererogatory acts. Things that like if you refrain from eating, we might even agree, if you refrain from eating cheeseburgers, you would harm less. You would create less harm. But
that doesn't.
the standard for like discharging your moral duty is like lower than that. That like it would be icing on the cake. You'd be doing more than what is required of you. I don't particularly like party with that idea exactly. Like I'm not going to bring it home to meet my parents. But I understand. I have some very dear friends who hold that position, and we have discussions sometimes. Yep. No, it's not necessarily about cheeseburgers, but like a more general, like philosopher type talk, right? Where they're like, I think that there's such a thing as supererogatory acts. I think that there's could be like, here's a better option and here's a worse option. I'm going to choose the worse option, and we're going to say like, that's okay, you can do that. Like I'm kind of inclined to be like, no, you should never be allowed to do that. Maybe we'll measure how hard we wag our finger at you, and we'll say like, yeah, you did your best. So like, but it wasn't the best.
Well, but shouldn't you always be allowed to, because that's liberty, it's freedom?
Whether or not you have a right to liberty, perhaps a right to your own opinions, regardless of whether they're true or false. If you believe that you have this right, well, let's note that like your supposed rights to liberty, at least in the political sense, suggests that like you should be free from any sort of governmental interference with exercising those liberties. Are we fining you? Are we arresting you? We're just disagreeing with you, right? We're just saying that like you're not making a good argument, and that's not. We think it's wrong. We might even go farther than that. We might follow you around, being like, wrong. He's wrong about this thing. Depends on how bad the thing is, right? We might say like, what you did was wrong. We're not going to elect you to the Senate. We're not going to elect you president. We're not going to let you participate in our communities. We're not going to we're not going to leave our children unattended around you. Like all kinds of consequences for people who believe and do things that we're like, no, that's wrong. It could be as simple as like, I'm going to sit with you and have a conversation. I think you're wrong, and that's like, but hopefully I'll do it in such a way where I go into that conversation with an open mind, willing to entertain, at least in principle, that I might be the one that's wrong. That the mere fact of our disagreement doesn't tell me who's right, or if anybody's right. Kind of brings us back full circle to the first class, doesn't it?
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
I'm going to stop right now, because like that's perfect bookends. Thanks for a great semester. I had a good time. I hope you did too. I'm looking forward to reading your final argument analyses, and best of luck getting through the end of the semester here. I hope that the holiday break brings you some peace.